lecture. This is lesson 2. This is the structure of language and also language and thought. So, over the course of this lecture, we'll be diving into what are the components of language. If you have taken my MLL 190 class, you should already be familiar with some of the components. Don't worry, we're not going to deep dive in them in this class. It's just to give an overview of, what is it that linguists have actually discovered about how language is structured. From there, we're going to go into a language of thought, talking about the ways in which language can influence thought, maybe determine thought. Just kidding, it doesn't determine thought, but looking at some of the theories and how they've been debunked over the years and reflecting on your thoughts and ideas regarding the influence of language. So let's get into it. Talking about structural linguistics, we're really talking about concerning or uncovering the understanding of the basic structural units. So if you were to take a language and you were to parse it into different components, what would you say? You would say, okay, well, language comprises of different ways of talking, right? Different ways of saying things. It comprises of speech sounds. It comprises of little information of units, units of meaning. It comprises of how you form certain sentences. How do you string words along to create meaning? And then what is it? What is it about meaning, or how does meaning change depending on the context? So, first off, phonetics. Phonetics is the study of production and the perception of sound. So, the human body can make a variety of sounds, but not all of them are encompassed into language. Linguists use certain sounds. We have certain typifications. So, for example, the sound "b" as in boy or book, right? We would classify them by the place and manner of articulation, which means we talk about where is it produced and how is it produced. So we know the word "ba" is it's bilabial, consists of two of your lips moving together, right? Ba. And we know that it's a stop, in that once you say the sound or once air passes through your vocal cords, the sound stops. It doesn't continue to vibrate. So "ba" would be very different than, for example, the word "s," right, or the sound "s," because it just stops. So we would say it's a bilabial stop. We would say "ba" is very different from other sounds because it's voice. When you put your hand on your vocal cords, you can actually hear yourself saying "b," right? So that means that it is has a voiced quality. So linguists have a way of typifying the sounds that we hear. You might have heard, or if you've been in my class, you might have practiced with the International Phonetic Alphabet. So this is just a system of writing about sounds, right? Um, to me, a lot of the IPA is very, it's 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 coordinated with English, right? Some of the sounds like "buh," it's the same sound that you learned in elementary school, but some of the other sounds are very different, and they're written in a very different way, right? So it doesn't have that English advantage. So if you haven't already had practice with the IPA, I definitely would recommend looking at the chart and practicing with some of the sounds. You'll also find the IPA in various dictionaries because this is kind of the standard among linguists to kind of figure out how something sounds without writing it down in a very English centric way. So phonology would really be the study of how all these sounds are organized, right? So humans are capable of making all human sounds, but it is not encompassed. And not every language makes use of every single sound that comes out of your body. For example, in English, we don't have what's called click, right? But other languages do have a click. English has about 24 consonants and about 15 vowels. I know in class in elementary school you were taught A, E, I, O, U, right? But it's a little bit more difficult because it's a little bit more complex because you have things like diphthongs. Um, and whereas, Japanese has fewer consonants and fewer vowels. So, someone who is a Japanese speaker visiting United States and trying to speak English, they might have difficulty just because some of the sounds aren't available in their repertoire as they're having to learn how to use new sounds. I'm sure some of you who are learning French right now, you're having to use new sounds, right? Just because a lot of the vowels that we use in English are very flat toned, and in French they're very expressive. So, like I mentioned in the last lecture, there's different rules about a sound pattern and how they can be used. And that determines whether things are grammatical or not. So, for example, if someone were to say, "Hey, what's your favorite zla?" You'd say, "What?" This doesn't really have any meaning, right? And it's also not grammatical in the sense in which there is this is can be a word, a possible word, right? Contrast that with what's your favorite block? So again, like I don't know what a block is. I'm sure in 100 years times they'll have a meaning for the word block. As of right now, there's no meaning for block, but this is a possible word. This is a grammatical word. Again, divorce the idea of grammar from don't say ain't and don't put the preposition uh, in between infinitives, or split infinitives. Sorry, these are different rules, right? Grammar means anything that can be created in the language, even if it doesn't have any meaning or doesn't have any sense. So block would be a grammatical word, but slow would not be a grammatical word, even though we don't have an attached meaning to them. So phonology also deals with different versions of sounds. So, for example, the S sound in cats is very different from the S sound in dogs, right? Cats, dogs. So we would say that cats has more of a typical S sound, whereas dogs has more of a Z sound, right? So you'll notice in a lot of different words, people on the internet spell them with a Z, right? And that's because it's voiced. The rule here is that if the S marker um, is following the end, a plural marker is following the end of a voiceless consonant like a T, then it would end in S. Whereas if it follows a voiced consonant like a G, then it would have a Z sound, right? And so you can also examine the T sound in a lot of words like top, stop, water, button. So for a lot of you, you're saying, well, the T sound sounds the same to me, but actually it's very different. So the T sound in top, top, sounds very typical to the T sound that you would use in a lot of words. Stop, right? That's an aspirated T. Stop. Water. A lot of you who are Native American English speakers, right? You would not say water, right? And I guarantee you probably wouldn't say, "Okay, can you give me a glass of water?" You would say something like water. And that's considered to be a flap. Now, that's very different, of course, if you speak something like British English. But even some versions of British English and American English, they also have different versions of T. So this word button, right? I guarantee you will not say button, right? But some people would say as a flap. Some people also have it as a glottal stop. So you say button, right? And that is just a variety of phonetics and a variety of language. So phonology also concerns with the rules of combining sounds into words. So, for example, what is this picture here? It is, I'm sure if all of you are familiar with the Baja Blast, it is a photo of the acclaimed restaurant, fast food restaurant, Taco Bell, right? But even the words that's saying taco is very different. So, for example, a lot of Americans would say taco with the ah, right? That's a low central front unrounded vowel. If you're British, you might say things like taco, right? And that's more of a near rounded front unrounded vowel. So these are ways in which we can differentiate the same word, but different pronunciations. We can use these IPA symbols to demonstrate that difference. So morphology is the study of internal word structure, right? So if I were to say, this is a wug, what would these two things right here be? You would say, well, those are wugs, right? So that is an indication that you know how to form plurals in the English language, right? We don't actually know, like wug is a made up word, but a lot of people can still use a made up word and add s, and you'd be able to determine because you understand the rules of your language that they are plurals, that there's more than one of them, for example. So they did experiments with children, where they would give them these images, and they would say, okay, here's this. What are two of them? And they would say, oh yeah, it's two wugs, right? And they weren't taught these words discreetly. Like they did not learn wug and then wugs, right? But they were able to kind of figure out from the rules of their language how to form plurality. So we also kind of understand this based on our indication of morphemes. So morphemes are these individual units of meaning. So if I were to say today I Pokemon Go, right? Today I went outside and I Pokemon Go'd. Um, I'm gonna go Pokemon Go now, right? So what would I say yesterday? Yesterday I Pokemon, and most of you would say I Pokemon Go'd, right? A lot of you probably wouldn't say I Pokemon went. And that's because we think of Pokemon Go as kind of a discrete unit, right? We're not thinking of Pokemon Go as two separate entities, Pokemon and then Go. We're thinking of it as one thing. So we would say Pokemon Go'd versus Pokemon went, even though went is a past time of go. It's a regular verb in English. Syntax is, again, talking about where the structure of grammatical is considered to be acceptable or well formed, depending on, this is according to the native speakers of the language. So, for example, um, if you have the sentence Jack and Jill went up the hill, you can then switch the object, right, up the hill, to the very front of the sentence. So you'd say up the hill went Jack and Jill, and that's a perfectly fine sentence. Now take the sentence, Sam and Sue ran up the bill, right? So we would say, yeah, that's the same kind of, structure as up the hill, right? But you would not say up the bill ran Sam and Sue, right? That doesn't sound correct in this language. And so this is kind of an understanding of, how words are formed, and how they are parsed together in your head. So word order varies a lot across different languages. In English, we use subject, verb, object, right? So we would say like I, the subject, ate, which is the verb, and cheese, which is the object. Spanish is also the same. Yo comí el queso, right? But the most common syntax that we have is subject, object, verb. So you'd have whatever subject is, you'd have the object, and then you have the verb at the very, very end. Japanese, Korean, Turkish, many others are this way. I think German is also this way. Sometimes the adjectives may come first, other times second, right? So we would say the black cat in English, but el gato negro in Spanish. Semantics is the study of literal meaning. So now that we actually know how words are formed, how do they make sense in the real world? So we're able to kind of understand the meaning of an expression by the structure and the meanings of its constituents. So for example, we're able to say, all right, that's a fat cat, right? That's a chonk, right? Um, and you be able to say, okay, I know what the word fat is, I know what the word cat is, so let me put those together, fat cat. So there are many exceptions to this, of course. For those of you who are not a native English speaker, you probably encounter lots of idioms that don't have literal meanings. Many exceptions, such as the word hot dog, right? If I said that's a fat cat, you would say, okay, yeah, that's a cat, that's a chonk. But if I said that's a hot dog, right, you would say, are you talking about the food that's a hot dog, or are you talking about, a dog that's really hot? And that also depends on pronunciation. Look at the ways in which I said that's a hot dog versus that's a hot dog, right? So there's different inflections, different stresses, depending on what kind of meaning you want to portray. And I like this phrase, right? It's all about semantics, right? It's all about the meaning. It's all about the different ways in which you say something that can cause confusion. So the example from your Mooney textbook says, if you want to, let someone go, right? If you want to fire them, how would you go about doing that? There's multiple ways in the English language that you could actually do that, right? Depending on your, um, depending on your connection with someone, and also depending on your audience, depending on your own individual style, depending on what they did, right? If they did something just awful, you would say you've been fired, you're fired, right? You could also say things like, I'm making you redundant, your job has been redundant, your job has been outsourced, all roles in your section have been demised. Or you could say, we're providing you with new opportunities, right? um, which may or may not actually mean that you've been fired. So if someone said to me, "You're providing you with new opportunities," I would say, "Am I fired?" I would say, "Cool." I wouldn't exactly know that I've been let go. So which one would you prefer if you were being let go? Which one would you prefer to tell an employee that you liked? And which one would you prefer to tell an employee that you disliked? I'm sure you would all pick A for that one. You're fired for those of you who dislike your employees. And pragmatics is very similar to that. Pragmatics is the study of meaning and context. So you can parse out the different words in semantics to kind of form meaning. Pragmatics is a way of kind of negotiating the context of the words in situation, and figuring out whether or not they may mean different things in different contexts. So, for example, this is an example I said yesterday, but I said, it's cold in here. If I came into a room and said it's cold in here to you, you would think several different things. You could say, oh, yeah, that could mean it's 15 degrees Fahrenheit, right? Um, I think we all can agree, even though some of us are from other places up north, more north than Maryland, so we could all agree that 15 degrees Fahrenheit is cold. It could also mean like, please turn off the air conditioner, right? Oh, it's just so cold in here, right? It could also mean you forgot to pay the heating bill again. It's so cold in here. Or it can mean something very different. So, like I said yesterday, if you had an argument, if you had an argument and someone came in, you could be like, "Ooh, wow, it's so cold in here," even though it could be 90 degrees. So your textbook also mentions these words: signs, signify, and so this comes from one of the founder of linguistics. His name is Ferdinand de Saussure. I think he's Swiss, but he basically said that language is a system of representation and helps humans to learn and use symbols. So we have things called signs, but they don't really actually make any sense until we have some sort of relationship with them. We have a signified. So we have maybe, like a stop sign, right? A stop sign by itself doesn't really mean anything unless we're able to ascribe some sort of concept to them. So that's how we would say, a stop sign says to, when you approach your car next, close to the stop sign, you stop your car, right? You press the brakes, right? So that is the concept of the sign. And so the sign is not literally a mapping from words to things. It's not really that simple. A lot of you probably have studied Chinese, or maybe you are Chinese descent, and so that could be our closest representation that a sign is what it means. But even then, it's very abstract. So for the Chinese sign for moon, actually, kind of maybe looks like a moon, right? But it takes some time, right? So over time, the signs become a little less representative and a little bit more abstract. And we could see this with the arbitrariness of sign. The last lecture I talked about dog, right? How dog meant different things in different languages. And then also, the international sounds of drinking and eating are very different. So take a look at this and see, what are different ways in which they represent eating in different countries. So we can also see this with various expressions. So in English, we always like to say, it's raining cats and dogs, to infer that there is a lot of rainfall, right? In other countries, let's say It's pouring from heaven. It's raining wheelbarrows. It's throwing cobbler knives. Earth and sand are falling. It's raining female trolls. Thank you, Norway. It's raining like a pissing cow. Thank you, France, right? So, we're able to see the same thing, but also have different ways of representing it. We can also see this with sign language that there is an arbitrary relationship between the form and the meaning, the sign and the signified. So, father in ASL, in American Sign Language, you would put your hand closer to the forehead, and then your thumb is on your forehead. Whereas father is more of your thumb is near your mouth in Chinese Sign Language. The same for suspect. You'd have your index finger kind of twirling up near your forehead and going downward. Whereas suspect in Chinese Sign Language looks more like an aloha in Hawaii. You're kind of able to you have a shaka and you're pressing it downward. So last lecture we talked about the concept of language and thought. Does what we say influence the way we think? And we would say, a lot of the linguists they contribute this early idea that language determine thought, and it's called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. So some of you who are taking anthropology classes, you're probably very familiar. Edward Sapir was a linguist. Benjamin Whorf was a fire inspector and also kind of like an amateur linguist. And he noticed that these people were these firefighters were putting out their cigarette butts in this can called empty, right? And they didn't know it was empty, right? There was no kind of test back then to see if it was empty, but the words empty by itself signified determined their thought patterns, and they were able to say, okay, this is safe, where it probably wasn't. And other scholars have really used the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, and so they looked at the Hopis, for example. Sapir really looked at and investigated this Native American tribe, and they said, well, okay, they don't really have any tenses, right? So they didn't really look at things in past tense or future tense, right? They just kind of examined the ways in which they were. They were very mindful, we would say, in these today's terms. And this is from a linguist that said it was impossible to learn their language without learning their world. And so I think, we would say that their idea of linguistic determinism is false by today's standards. Like, language does not determine thought. But we would say, some of the early recognitions of their ideas really focus on this idea that when studying a language, you should study the culture as well. And that's something that I think we take for granted. But Sapir-Whorf was, they were kind of the first pioneers in this regard. And they hypothesized that there was a relationship between the language you speak and the way that you view the world, or did they? Because a lot of people think it's contested. A lot of the work is about language influencing thought. Was well established in the late 19th century. It predated Sapir-Whorf's work. Most of Whorf's work in Hopi language speakers were in Arizona, and Whorf was like, oh, they perceive time differently from English speakers. But consider English in the fact that we don't necessarily have a future tense, right? We would say like, we will be going to the beach on Tuesday, or on in September we will be doing this. But there's no really tense as far as like how we have inflections to signify past tense. That's something that's very missing in English, but we still perceive the future the same way, right? Um, so I already talked about how Worf was this amateur linguist, but just because you don't have the word for it doesn't mean that you don't think about it. So this hypothesis has really been debunked. What people you know, would say about linguistic determinism. So this is what they would say the prison house of language is that it is false, right? So just because someone speaks a different language doesn't mean they view a world in a different way. We might think they would, and a lot of people actually use this in very metaphorical terms. So, for example, they would say, oh, yes, like when I learned Spanish, I just became a different person, right? I just became so open to Spanish customs and Spanish ideas, and, just learning Spanish just opened this world for me. And that might be true. Like you might, be taking more siestas than you did before, but learning Spanish doesn't make you into a different person, right? Um, this isn't determined. Now there might be some ways in which your worldview can be shaped by the culture. So for example, I have a friend, her name is Martha, and she, in English, or, she's American, but, when she speaks English, she's very timid. She speaks in a very low kind of voice. But she also speaks Spanish. And when she speaks Spanish, she's like, soy Marta. She's just very lively. And, I often think, like, does that impact her identity? Does these languages really, influence the ways in which she's able to think and speak and interact with people? Right? So, this is a question. Does our worldview shape our language, make it difficult to immediately understand distinctions that speakers of other languages make? Sometimes I think it is difficult, speaking with people who might have a different language ability, but, translation is possible, understanding is possible. So we would say that just because you speak two different languages, and I know sometimes you think, oh my gosh, this group of people speaks a very different language than me, or this person just speaks an entirely different language than me, but worlds apart. But the reality is that understanding is possible. Um, and looking at other countries and other terms or expressions, this could be a case too. So take a moment to read some of these expressions in other countries. I like this one, the Japanese one, a mother who relentlessly pushes her children toward academic achievement. That sounds like my mom. Okay, so this, the superior worth hypothesis really, garnered a lot of attention back in the day. And it also spurred off these different moments in which they looked at other cultures and they said, oh my gosh, look at this culture. They have multiple words for something, and that means that their worldview is shaped by these words. So this is what we call the Great Eskimo vocabulary hooks. And so they looked at the Inuit, and the Inuit apparently has some very large words for snow. And you probably heard of this, right? You probably heard of someone saying, "Oh, did you know?" And the Eskimos, they have 300 words for snow, right? And people would say, "Oh, that's very interesting," right? But the problem is, Inuit words are very long and complex, so there's hundreds of ways of saying basically the same word. Um, and there's really only four basic words for snow. If you think about it, English also has words for snow. So we have snow, we have slush, we have slurry, we have powder, right? And so to say that the Inuit have more words for snow because they're just surrounded by snow a lot, it's very different um, than it's actually very similar actually than to American English. We have a lot of words for snow. And so a lot of linguists, maybe they don't believe in determinism, that language definitely, um, you know, influences your or determines your thought. But we would say, some of us would say that we believe in linguistic relativism and that language influences the way that you see the world. It could influence the way that you see color, the way you see gender, the way you see time, the way you see place. And I'll kind of give you some examples. But some of the words used at political conventions could also dictate the ways in which you perceive of certain things. So, for example, at the RNC in 2020, Republican National Convention, they use words like hero, media, tax, crime, bless, city, farm, God, great. So why would they say these words? Why would they choose to use these words over, for example, the Democratic National Convention in 2020? They use words like climate, meet purpose, mean, together, better, lose, caring, right? So Language is used very purposefully, and we'll talk about that in our politics lecture. It's not necessarily that these words aren't random. They are being used to convey a certain promise, a certain message, a certain ideology. So here's a linguistic relativity experiment, and you don't really need anything other than maybe a sheet of paper and a pen if you already have it. So, on the following slides, you'll see images of animals or babies, and your task is to jot down a name for the animal or baby. Not just say, oh, this is a cat, but to jot down a name. So, you would say, oh, this cat's name is blank, right? So, just go what first comes in your mind. Think about what suits the animal or baby in question. So, I'll just go through these slides and you'll write down the name. Okay, so look at your 10 names and count. How many names are masculine names, names only used for males? How many names are feminine names, names only used for females? And how many names are gender neutral, which could be used for either gender? So they actually did this experiment in England. When the students were asked to undertake this task, the male names came up more frequently by a statistically significant margin. So they, surveyed hundreds of students, and they came up with more male names for these pets and for these babies more so than female names. So the naming experiment is kind of an experiment to think about how language can affect how you think about gender. What are these perceptions of gender? What is the cultural value of gender based on how they use these names? And in the real experiments, the English speakers were compared to speakers of languages that do not mark gender. So, for example, Finnish, Estonian, and Mandarin Chinese have epicene pronouns. So they use more like like we don't, instead of using like he or she, they would use more of an third person singular. And a lot of the speakers actually, when they try to speak English or learning English, they kind of mess up, quote unquote, mess up with the pronouns, and that's why, because they don't have a gendered pronoun in their language. So, what do you think happened when researchers compared these speakers of languages with gendered third person pronouns to speakers whose languages did not have a gendered third person pronoun in the experiment? So they found that these speakers, and they tested not only English speakers but also Portuguese speakers, with the speakers of Curitania and Mandarin, and they found that speakers languages who marks gender in third person, so like he or she, they would have a pronoun for he or she. They are more likely to use masculine names. But those speakers of languages without gendered third person pronouns, so Mandarin, Finnish, Estonian, they're more likely to include more feminine names as well as more gendered neutral names. But even so, the speakers with epicene pronouns show a statistically significant preference for masculine names. Very interesting, right? So we could say that, again, language is, your structure or um, the ways in which you are able to form pronouns in your language, whether or not they have a gender attached to them, right? That actually affects the way you think naming conventions, right? And so this is what this study is trying to say. But there's still this, underlying question of why there are more masculine names than feminine names. That could be due to culture. That could be due, to other things that don't have anything to do with language. So, linguistic relativity has really been ignored mostly for the 20th century, right? There's lots and lots of books out there for them about them, but it's mostly rejected because they the early scholars came up with this ethnocentric approach, right? So it was mostly white European linguists who would go into like the Amazon. They'd go to, like Worf went to or sorry, Sapir went to the Hopi tribe in Arizona. They look at Australian Aboriginal languages and they would say, oh, these weird features. Like, aren't these people like, oh, they don't know how to tell time? And that was really racial. That's a really ethnocentric approach, right? So that's why a lot of linguists kind of look down upon early 20th century methods because they were kind of weren't looking from the lens of a purely linguistic lens, right? But it's, a lot of new research has come out to kind of explore these ideas of linguistic relativity. So, one example that they have in your textbook is about colors. So, while English has one term for blue, Russian has two. There's one for light blue and one for dark blue. So, the question is, are we not able to see color because we don't have a term for it? A lot of linguists would say yes, a lot of linguists would say no, right? um, we were able to see, okay, I see on the spectrum this color, but just because we don't have a particular word for it doesn't mean we actually don't see it. But, there have been studies on Russian speakers and looking in the ways they're able to classify light blue and dark blue, and they're much quicker at it. They're faster at it. They can see these stark differences because they do have a word in their language that denotes um, denotes the two different terms, right? If you're from North Carolina like me, you notice that the kind of blues that you have is very different depending on whether you support University of North Carolina, UNC, or depending on whether you support Duke. So, early research into this linguistic relativity of color difference, color perception, found that different languages that have different color words appear to divide the color spectrum differently. Some languages they might not have a color for blue, but they'll have a color for dark and they'll have a color for light, right? Although some have argued that these are not really genuine color terms, they're more of a contrast, right? um, but speakers of languages with only limited color words find it harder to distinguish subtle shades, right? Do you know the shade for chartreuse? Do you know the shade for turquoise? Right? These are very different. Artists might see color very different than someone who doesn't have an eye for art, as per se, or a layman per se, right? So, a lot of research has looked at, okay, what are the colors that you have? A lot of the cultures don't have a light color. They'll have a word for light color and they'll have a word for dark color. But if the language has a third color, it's usually red. It's always red, right? And if they have more colors, if they have like 4 or 5 colors, it's followed by blue, green, and then yellow. So, is this language or is this something else going on? Is this human cognition, right? So this suggests that perhaps human thought and cognition affecting language, um, you know, it might be more that, we're thinking about color and that language has, we're thinking about color as humans and it's something universal rather something that's relegated to your language. Here's another example. Is this person sitting behind a desk or in front of the desk? A lot of English speakers would say this person is sitting behind the desk, right? But in other languages, such as Hausa, they say you are sitting in front of the desk, right? So the desk and you face the same direction, right? So you project the face or the front of the desk is closest to you. So, they do experiments in which they ask people, based on your language, what are the ways in which you see space? How do you see orientation? How do you see time? And it could be different, but again, as we've seen before, it's not necessarily deterministic, and it's not necessarily something that you can't understand, right? So that concludes this lecture. Think about these things. You can choose to write about any or all these questions for your discussion board posts. Remember about the word limit, right? So the questions are language and thought the same thing? Can you think without language? Can you talk without thinking? Do you think your language affects the way you think? Can you personally think in other languages? And what are some other places in which you see linguistic relativism? So some of you probably speak other languages, you probably speak other dialects. Are there other places in which you see different words impacting the way in which you see the world? Um, Good luck on the discussion board. I look forward to your posts, and I will see you next time.